Well, welcome everybody. This is the 5th seminar that we're running in this program with MOLA. And today's speaker is Robert Tavernor. And so a warm welcome to him. I'm standing in, as it were, for Eric, who is in Japan and should be asleep by now. He's had a very long day. I spoke to him earlier. And he reminded me of the overlap of his career with Robert's, having taught together at Polytechnic of Central London, as was, and then through academia moved to Cambridge, and the key link there being Joseph Rickwert in terms of the PhD work that you did. And in a way, Robert is an architect, an academic, an urbanist, and will explain in his talk that link, which I think is so important for this program, about what's beneath and how that has informed our city today. And having been the head and professors at both Edinburgh, Bath, and then moved with the program for cities at LSE to that scope, which is about cities, the planning of them, and the governance of them. So a very interesting progression from those early and very important books, which make me feel really stupid in terms of the skills that you have in terms of Alberti, Palladio, and the depth of those books and translations. And I'm sure that's going to be brought out in Robert's talk today. In terms of this practice, it has been, in a way, Robert's latest role, which has been in terms of townscape and assessment of proposals. And it's interesting that only yesterday, the Corporation of London sort of republished the vision for the city cluster, within which we've got a number of towers. And Robert has been involved with that process through the planning and the townscape and visual assessment. And I will plug again the very good talk that Robert gave as part of our previous seminar program on the shaping and this idea of why the cluster is as it is. It's a landscape, it's not a prescriptive design. So do look that up. That was back in January 2023 and is available on the website. So I'd like to welcome Robert, and we look forward to hearing about this link to antiquity.
Thank you, Robert. I'm not very good with microphones, I'm afraid. I'd see whether I can bellow it rather than this. Now, I should confess at the outset that I've never given a lecture on archaeology before, or vaguely resembling it, or I hadn't thought so until I looked up the definition of archaeology, which is a good academic thing to do. And it's quite simple. It's the study of human history and prehistory through the excavation of sites and the analysis of artifacts. So pretty straightforward. And that helps me then to go into a subject area that I do know, and I'm going to start with a sort of preamble on the Italian Renaissance, because it was during the 15th century that archaeology really took off. Not as a sort of scientific discipline in the same way that it is now, but really as a line of inquiry, trying to understand what the forms and details of Roman buildings were like, recording them. There are stories by Vasari of Donatello and Brunelleschi going to Rome, excavating, making drawings, understanding how vaults worked. And so it was very informative for them, but it was something that they then turned into their own artistic and architectural endeavors. And I think that's really the theme of what I'm going to be talking about this evening, is how you use, how the information has been used to turn it into something else, and really to consider more recent ways of representing the past, particularly through the use of computers, which has been controversial, but also particularly in terms of public realm experience, and where that's gone wrong, and hopefully where it's going right now, with the guidance of the City of London, in particular. So let me start with my first slide. So this is a topographical map of Rome, probably in the early 16th century, late 15th century. And it shows very simply the layout of Rome through the River Tiber, the area of the Vatican on one side, the walls of the city, and the key monuments. So here you've got the Pantheon, the Colosseum, and the Quirinal Hill. Sorry, the Capitoline Hill, and the Quirinal Hill beyond. So there is this very clear identification of all the parts, and that would be useful, of course, for most people, tourists, those going there for religious events and so on. But it wasn't helpful at that time when they wanted more precision about everything. And so there was a process that went on of scrutinizing Latin texts, trying to understand what the true meaning of various buildings were, because a lot of them were described only through mythology, a lot of which was word of mouth down the centuries. But also, as I mentioned, by measuring, excavating, and recording the buildings carefully. Now, a key figure in the church at that time was a scholar called Flavio Biondo. And he was born in the late 1300s. He was particularly active 1430s, 40s. But he produced, I mean, he was, he knew more about the history of Italy than many others. And he spent a great deal of effort writing about Rome restored. And that was really the first sort of compendious approach to that subject. That was written in the 1440s. And he was sponsored by a very good patron, as anyone had to be at that time, who was a cardinal, Prospero Colonna, who provided finance for him not only to do works like that, but to actually start excavations on the Quirinal Hill, where they thought there was a palace beneath the surface of a particular character. But also to raise two ancient Roman ceremonial barges that were in Lake Nemi outside Rome, to bring them to the surface and to bring them ashore. Unfortunately, I believe one broke in half as they tried to do this. But anyway, it was a major event at the time. A contemporary of his was someone, as Robert mentioned at the beginning, I've spent a chunk of my research career looking at Leone Battista Alberti, who was also in the papal curia with Biondo. He was 12 years younger, but he was fascinated by what Biondo was doing. And again, a very gifted scholar who translated a whole range of texts from the ancient world and tried to make sense of them. But more than Biondo, he was that sort of universal man that was applauded by Vasari and others subsequently. He was someone who, he was an athlete. He claimed he could jump over a horse with his feet tied. He could do all sorts of wonderful things like that. But he was also a sculptor, a painter. He codified how Brunelleschi first formulated perspective, and so it goes on. But from my point of view, and for this, what he started was a commentary on the Roman architect Vitruvius's work, his so-called 10 books on architecture. But he found it very difficult to make much sense of Vitruvius because Vitruvius's Latin wasn't as good as Alberti's, it seems, and he just there was so much contradiction, so hard to follow without illustrations and without buildings, which clearly went with the descriptions that Vitruvius was providing. Hence the need to do more research into the buildings themselves. Alberti went on. He gave up on the commentary and wrote his own treatise on architecture, his own 10 books, which became absolutely fundamental to the spread of classical architecture through Italy and around the world subsequently. So he was a major figure. So this is the sort of experience of Rome still into the early 16th century on the left-hand side. This is the Temple of Romulus, Antonius and Faustina, and then the papal curia beyond on the Roman Forum. And you can see there was a lot of debris, a lot of fluvial deposits from the Tiber, which flooded the area, and the whole area was in decay. What Alberti did was devise a surveying tool which allowed him to measure accurately from the Capitoline Hill and triangulating around where all those key monuments that I showed you in the first slide were accurately located. And he produced a map through this technique, which he describes in detail, and retracing how he does it demonstrates that actually it's very accurate in relation to an ordnance survey map today. So this is the beginning of uncovering the knowledge that they sought. As I mentioned, Alberti was a sculptor. This is his own medallion plaque that he made of his own profile with his name at the side, looking very Roman. And one of his key patrons who came from Florence was that man. It's a later painting from the 18th century, but it shows Giovanni Rucellai. Giovanni Rucellai was a major banker in Florence. And indeed, because of Alberti's profound knowledge of the antiquities, a lot of the Florentines went to Rome and tried to grasp what was going on there through Alberti's medium. So he did a sort of tourist guide number. He took Lorenzo de' Medici and a circle of other nobles around there. Lorenzo, of course, went on to become a patron of Michelangelo and other prominent artists. So it was a very closely knit circle. What Giovanni Rucellai commissioned from Alberti was a new facade for the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, which is close to the railway station there now, which was a refacing, basically, of the original building, a refacing of several houses with a palace frontage, the creation of a loggia where family events would take place in front of a piazza, and a sepulchre in which Giovanni Rucellai's body would be laid when he died. And that assemblage of or ensemble of buildings is represented here. This was placed in the chapel of in San Pancrazio, a church behind his palace. So it was part of the Rucellai quarter. And this shows the influences that Alberti drew on archaeological sites, such as it was called the Septizonium, had 7 zones to it, but the Septizonium used to be located close to the Colosseum before it was demolished in modern times to widen the road, I believe. And also this, which is the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which marks the place, of course, where Christ's body was laid. So Rucellai speaks proudly of how he sent surveyors out to Jerusalem to measure the sepulchre. They brought back dimensions, which then Alberti interpreted and indeed perfected in a way through the use of geometry and measure. And Alberti even designed the lettering around the frieze, as a lettering becoming increasingly important then because of the rise of the printing presses and so on. Now, this information I put together with Joseph Rickwert for an exhibition in Mantua, which opened in 1994 and 95. I'm delighted that Alan Jones is here in the front row, who now a famous architect in his own right, but he was in those days a willing participant in preparing for this exhibition all those years ago. But what I just want to use this to show was the use of computers 30 years ago to represent the history of the past. It was probably the most comprehensive exhibition of its kind in the use of computers. We were sponsored by, this is an exhibition I curated with Joseph Rickwert, and the money for the project came from Olivetti, who were in their final death throes, sadly, as a company. But they were producing, they'd gone beyond typewriters to computers at that point. And they supplied us with what were then sort of state-of-the-art computers. And we had a surveyor go out to Italy, measure the buildings, put that into computer format. The models were created from drawings that Alan and others produced in the office, and a model maker in Florence, who in fact the model maker who had repaired the dome of Florence Cathedral model, which was damaged in the floods in the 1960s, then built these fabulous models using the computer information. So it's all laser cut. So really quite, I mean, that's almost the size of a Fiat 500, I think, that building. It's the Tempio Malatestiano. Casts were made of elements of that building, so on, life-size casts. And then we use the computers to show different interpretations, because not all the information was there as to how these buildings were built. And to also relay other aspects, so San Sebastiano, the church in Florence, the Annunziata, and also city models, that's partly of Sant'Andrea and Mantua, to understand the idea of movement through cities, and the importance of the relationship of parts of Alberti's architecture to creating the right sort of ambience and character for public realm. And then this final image from that, showing that in close up, and of course then laser cut models and so on, as well as more traditional representations from paintings and so on. Now it had a mixed reception 30 years ago as an exhibition. It was opened with great fanfare by the President of the Italian Republic, but the Italian critics, well, it didn't help that we weren't Italian, I think, but the Italian critics were concerned that in a way the computers were getting in a way of the actual message that we were trying to convey. Maybe we got the balance wrong, but I think it's just interesting how this idea has now taken off and become much more of a norm in terms of exhibitions these days. So leaping forwards, but still in the past, to Walbrook and the London Mithraeum, which I want to really focus on two examples, the Mithraeum and Eric Parry Architects development on Fenchurch Street. Now, they represent different aspects of archaeology. This site really becomes important because it became a huge hit. It became incredibly popular with the London crowds. And what was discovered was this is the site of what is, of course, now the Bloomberg European headquarters, but it was at that time a bomb site, and it was also where what was called Bucklersbury House was proposed to be built. And it was whilst digging the foundations beyond the bomb damage that they began to find this temple form. They weren't quite clear what it was at first because it had several layers of history overlaying it. They thought it was a temple of Bacchus because that was possibly the last use of it. But they found out that it was a temple for Mithras, for a reason I'll explain in a moment. But this is the crowds in 1954. I mean, the excavations went through 1952, 53, but by 1954 it would become a major spectacle to actually go and visit this site. And you can see from these contemporary photographs, they were getting 30,000 people a day coming to the site. 5,000 people were turned away apparently on one occasion. Movie Town News, one of the big means of conveying this out of London, and through an animated process and with commentary and so on, covered it. And of course, even the Daily Mail is there. So here you see, all day they queued, 30,000 see Roman Temple, and then they show the route of everybody going in here. Now, this was clearly a find soon after the Second World War. People were looking for something in their London, what was left of it. And the temple and its mysteries seemed to capture the public imagination. The British cabinet, it was a Conservative government then, Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, they were very intrigued, they were very aware of this public interest, and they felt that something had to be done to preserve it. It's not surprising that they found something on the site. This is the urban block that became to be occupied by Bucklersbury House. The Mithraeum is in this area here, and you can see this was the line of the Walbrook River as it goes into the Thames, the site there. So it actually overlaps that edge before it was conduited by the Victorians, I believe. And you can see its relationship to the Forum and the layout generally, the amphitheatre where the Guildhall is at the top left. And then a closer look, there was the house of Sir Thomas More, a mayor of London in the 1300s, and of course St Stephen Walbrook, which was there both in the 11th century and then moved to its current site in the 15th century. So it's an area of great archaeological interest. Anyway, it had been bombed, and the Victorian pattern of occupation had clearly been erased over time as well. Now, I love this photograph because this is the eminent Professor William Grimes, who was leading the excavation, helped by students for the most part. But I just love it as a sort of health and safety image. There he is on top of a ladder being supported by two sturdy men, one hopes, and taking photographs of the site. So it gives you a sense of the different methods that were employed at the time. This is the great find that they found towards the end of their first period of digging, 52 to 53, which is the head of the young god Mithras, which allowed them then to understand fully what the temple was about. You can see from this photograph the stepped form of the temple. It wasn't entirely flat. It's quite small and intimate, as you can see by the relationship to the figures there. And there is Professor Grimes holding the head, and someone else, again, interesting characters, holding other elements that were found there. Now, anything of value like this found its way then to the Museum of London. But a lot of the other debris that went up to make the excavation was actually just taken to a churchyard initially. It hadn't been numbered, the stones hadn't been numbered or properly identified. And then after that, apparently to a builder's yard. So they had the core elements of the temple surviving there. But when it came then to decide what should happen next, there was some difficulty. And basically what the Conservative government insisted was that Legal and General make this temple visible for the public in the future. Legal and General, not unreasonably, said, well, look, we've got a scheme which is going up. It's based on Lend-Lease money, which came out of the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which sounds reminiscent of what's happening with the US and Ukraine now. But the US gave military aid and finance to Britain at the time of the Second World War on the basis of a payment over a long period of time, a long lease period. In fact, Britain didn't stop paying off their loans until 2006, so it was a lot of money over a long period of time. But out of that formula, a number of buildings were built to help reconstruct London. And Bucklersbury House was in fact the largest office building to be built in the 50s as a Lend-Lease office block. And there it was. And it was tall for its time. The regulations up until the Second World War had been no higher than 30 meters, but with the damage that had been done and the need to stimulate growth again, that was extended upwards. So there was an uplift from 10 to 15 floors, which is the height of this building as it stood at that time. It's not a thing of great beauty, and it didn't particularly improve with age. This was not long. I think this was probably in the 60s or so. The Legal and General said that to incorporate the original temple in its the position it was found would mean losing 7 floors of accommodation, which they weren't willing to sanction, and the government had no financial means at their disposal to persuade them otherwise. So they came to a resolution, which was on one hand to produce these rather wonderful 1960s etched glass depictions of Mithraean mysteries, which were produced by John Hutton for the entrance into Bucklersbury House, and to place a reconstruction of the temple on the well, in fact, over a garage, over the car parking area, but on Victoria Street. Professor Grimes was naturally, on one hand, delighted that it was going to be retained in some form or another, but not at all happy that they didn't take his advice or even really ask for his opinion on what should be done. This was an expedient place to locate it, and so there it was put. And what's even more wonderful, given that it was the 1960s, is that some very fashionable crazy paving was inserted on the floor of the temple. You can see that the level changes that I pointed out earlier weren't really followed. The stones were not necessarily in those positions in the original building. So to put it mildly, it wasn't an accurate reconstruction of what was found. Nonetheless, it was accessible, and the public went to see it, and so it went on until, indeed, in 2007, then English Heritage listed it, Grade 2. And it was listed not for the reconstruction, but because it was an assemblage of stones that had belonged to that site originally, to the original temple site. But because it had been such an important moment in the history of archaeology, it had been a moment where there was a great awareness about the relevance of archaeology and the significance that these remains had in understanding the layout of this part of London. My first encounter with this site was then in 2007, when my consultancy was asked to, on the basis that it had just been listed, was to argue that it should be removed, and as part of the redevelopment of the site, moved to somewhere more suitable, i.e. Close to its original location. The scheme that was being developed by then was by Foster and Partners and Atelier Jean Nouvel, the famous helmet scheme, which I think might have got consent, but anyway, it wasn't popular. And then Bloomberg acquired the site in 2010 and retained only Foster and Partners and went forward with another scheme, the one that was built. But this shows again that urban block that Bucklersbury House was situated on. You can see its layout on the site. Walbrook running it down here. And you can maybe remember from the Victorian map that this larger 15-story building just obliterated the original line of Watling Street, which went through the site. And there is that Victorian map with Budge Row leading into Watling Street as named beyond. And of course, Queen Victoria Street had been cut through the site in the 19th century. The Foster scheme, completed in 2017, picks up on that line, and also incorporated the temple underground, very, very close to its original position, and I'll explain why only close in a minute. Views of the building, as you're aware, a very beautifully built building, reputed to have cost £1 billion to build altogether, so it should be, and with the reinstated access through the site. Along the frontage on Victoria Street, instead of the temple remains, there are now evocative reminiscences, if you like, of the Walbrook itself. However, with the same sort of mistake, I guess, in placing of the temple itself, they're placed along Victoria Street when, of course, the Walbrook ran at right angles to this. But nonetheless, it's there. It's a bronze sculpture which uses original branches and so on to make the form with water flowing through it. So it gives a good sense of history and origins for that site. but more so with the London Mithraeum itself, which was developed by MOLA with a close working relationship with Foster and Partners to create something quite extraordinary, which really picks up on the true nature of what a Mithraeum was like. It certainly wasn't meant to be above ground, above a car park, of course. It was actually the initiates would worship in cave-like spaces in semi-darkness. It was always a small, intimate space. The focus was the sacrifice of the bull. It was a colonnaded space, reasonably enclosed, and the initiates or the different ceremonies would go on, usually involving food of some sort or another. But it was not easy, obviously, to find a way of making that work. But it is pretty much in the same position. They moved it, I believe, slightly west of its original position, largely so that as not to disturb those parts of the excavation which hadn't been dug out for future work. And of course, by using computers, light, sound, one gets an understanding as best as one can of what that experience might have been like. In a way, this has set a standard for this type of presentation. I mean, clearly there are others. The Guildhall has the amphitheatre exhibition, and above ground, the amphitheatre is marked in the paving of Guildhall Yard. So there is a sense there of the scale of the building itself, and again, with the parts of the remains, some sense of its overall form. Most recently, as you're aware, with 85 Gracechurch Street, more remains have been found, but this time in relation to the Roman Basilica on Gracechurch Street. So we've found this sort of corner element, and the idea of revealing excavations below ground within the entrance foyer, and then again having visuals to actually describe, give some sense of what was there. So those are one way of dealing with antiquity and their role in the modern world. The other, slightly more traditional one is obviously through spaces like Salter's Garden next to the London Wall, which David Hicks originally laid out a garden. I think it was in 1981, a knot garden, and which was then reworked and in its present form. It's a very beautiful space against the walls there. There's a Michael Ayrton bull. And then obviously with London Wall Place, which Make Architects developed as part of their office development, and with this sort of sinuous Corten bridge over the site of St Alphege, that was part of a priory structure that was there. I mean, one is very quiet space with the protection of the wall and buildings around it. This one is obviously much livelier because of the London Wall traffic running by it. But nonetheless, it's a way of contrasting antiquity with modernity and finding places of repose from the normal day and life of the city. And finally, I want to just talk about my hosts here and the Hall Island site as I knew it originally, but now as 52 Fenchurch Street, because this is another type of space which is much more to do with improving movement networks for pedestrians through this part of the city. It's very close to Fenchurch Street station, which is behind this viewpoint. So as you can see, perhaps here, there's the site in red, Fenchurch Street Station, and other main areas. This is the central part of the eastern cluster of tall buildings. So there's a lot of people going through this area. And initially, well, obviously, EPA had worked on One Fen Court and made something of a space through the heart of the building and around its edge, with encouragement from city planners. But the movement from that point was through Star Alley, which is a very confined pedestrian street, off which were then there is this historic tower. And the Clothworkers Hall, another livery company, on one side. Now, again, my consultancy were asked to look at this site with a view to demolishing the Clothworkers Hall and therefore getting a certificate of immunity from listing, so that a project could be put on this site, which EPA then took up. So there's the All Saints Hallows staining tower. It's a bit of a mouthful anyway, whatever it is. Here we are. It's the Tower of All Hallows Saints staining. And there are here 3 representations of it, one from the earlier part of the 18th century, showing its setting then, and in the late 19th century, and more recently with obviously a lot of office buildings around it. So it's a very much a changed setting. Surrounded by railings, this very narrow Star Alley wrapping around one side of it, moving towards the church. So it was a place that has potential, but one that wasn't being particularly explored well. There was a scheme before the war which wasn't really finished or developed properly until after the war by the architect Austin Hall for the Clothworkers, and this is the scheme of the building as proposed in 1953, and you can see the setting that it provides for the tower here. So there was really, this was the facade which had the most architecture, if you like, Portland stone and the ornament. By the 1980s, there'd been the 1950s, 1960s church hall built next door to it. You can see what was built of the Clothworkers and Hall's design behind it, the railings that should wrap round to Star Alley. And then the elevation of the hall for the main access. These are the doors which lead into or led into the Clothworkers, which we identified as perhaps the most interesting part of the building externally to be retained going forward. And then the historical site, if you like, is to the right of this. Now, the architects came up with a series of sketches, and I think Gwyn was party to some of these discussions as senior planner as well, in terms of how best to open up Fenchurch Street to make more of this route through the site towards and from Fenchurch Street Station, and to make much more of a positive feature of the tower itself. The Clothworkers Hall, now demolished, has a new entry building pavilion with the doors that were at the side inserted in them, very much along the lines of the Holborn Museum in Bath, which is a wonderful building, actually, really very clever addition to a Grade 1 listed Georgian building, which provoked much controversy when it was proposed, but has been much loved now by the local residents. But it's a very nice way of creating a contrast in the materials of the terracotta and glass with the rough stonework of the building itself. And then from Fenchurch Street station moving towards the site, the tower dwarfed, of course, by the scale of what's being proposed and what's already been built at Fen Court across the street, providing a more of a street level embracing of the site, but a much more open route then through. So I think this is of an earlier scheme, but it shows really how that alleyway has now become a proper public space. And indeed it is public because there is access then to the level 10 podium garden of the building, which is publicly accessible, as well as down to a crypt, which had also been preserved. In fact, that was the crypt had come from another site. It actually come from near London Wall itself a long time before, and which is grade 2 listed. So one has an experience of the tower in its new garden setting in a way, or certainly a new public realm setting, and then a route up or down to experience the area in a different way. And this seems to be very much a pattern for new developments within the City of London, for the public to gain access much more to these places, so that they are something that they can engage with directly themselves. Now, I'd like to end with a more controversial tone, which I'm hoping might stimulate some discussion. One is through my and our great teacher, Joseph Rickwert, who wrote The Idea of a Town, first published in 1963, which was a new take on how ancient cities, how European cities were formed via the Romans. And there was a nice review of it by the historian Spiro Kostov, which I'm just going to read a bit from, because it's then his words rather than mine. He says about the book, and Rickwert's book, Roman towns and their history are generally regarded as being the preserve of the archaeologist or the economic historian. Joseph Rickwert has considered them as works of art. His starting point is the mythical, historical, and ritual texts in which their foundation is recounted, rather than the excavated remains. He examines first of all the Etruscan rite, a group of ceremonies by which all, or practically all, Roman towns were founded. The basic institutions of the town, its walls and gates, its central shrines and its forum, are all of them part of a pattern to which the rituals and the myths that accompanied them provide clues. It is refreshing to look at standard themes of the history of urban design from a non-rational point of view, to see surveyors as quasi-priests and orthogonal planning as a sophisticated technique touched by divine mystery. Rickwert's lasting worth will be to wrench us away from rationalist simplicities and to make us face the fundamental disquiet of the human spirit in its claim to a permanent place on the land. Now, I'd like to then just add to that. I mean, many of you will know Christopher Woodward, who's the director of the Garden Museum in London. And he wrote a book a few years ago called In Ruins, A Journey Through History, Art and Literature. And there's a nice passage there where he says, a ruin is an incomplete dialogue between an incomplete reality and the imagination of the spectator. His sympathies are with decay rather than preservation. A ruin has two values. It has an objective value as an assemblage of brick and stone, and it has a subjective value as an inspiration to artists. You can uproot the older tree, erect more fences, spray more weed killer, excavate and polish. You will preserve every single brick for posterity and analyse the very occasional discovery of a more ornamental fragment in a learned publication. You will have a great many bricks, but nothing more. If the archaeologists had arrived before Shelley, there would be no Prometheus Unbound. I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. We will open to questions from the floor, but I did want to just start with reminding ourselves in a previous seminar that the 2 teams of archaeologists on 120 Fenchurch and 50 found the ditch, right, the original line of the Roman city. Okay. And it went through and they were able to map it as connected. So that was a really lovely moment when both archaeologists had that moment. But going back to your 1995 exhibition and talking about the computer for movement and how we've worked with your consultancy, the question that is normally asked is these fixed viewpoints, which is, the seminar you gave previously. So this question about whether we should be using that more dynamically with our design rather than the perspective, the viewpoint. That's a sort of a thought. But more probably a question is, because there's so much to find in the ground, and the Bloomberg and the Mithraeum is an amazing experience, but you do feel like it's funded by a very rich building.
It is.
And you the people who take you around, they must be doing, they're probably at the LSE or something. I don't know. They seem that smart. So, in a way, slightly question to the planning team in the room: how do we make that stuff available sustainably? Because it costs lots of money, which is why Legal & General didn't put it at the bottom of their building, because they wouldn't be able to build over it or whatever reason. So how do you get that access that can be for the future and doesn't get dusty?
Well, I can answer the first question perhaps, but not the second. In terms of the first, it is already recognised that kinetic experience is important in terms of assessing the impact of distant buildings on an urban landscape. So that's already there. And indeed, the first public inquiry I did back in 2001 for the Heron Tower, Miller Hare produced these kinetic views with a camera where every frame they put in the image of the Heron Tower at a different, but actually it proved sensationally helpful at the public inquiry to understand how something comes in and out of view, and also what the different weather times of the day do to a building. So you're right. It's not helpful having these static views only. However, technology is such that they are still the most accurate, and one has to use them as an aid and sort of put them together to understand, to get a sense of what it's like. There is nothing yet, even these goggles and so on, which really accurately gives them a true experience of what a building is going to be like. But there are these different means of doing so. But yes, it should be improved. It will be improved, I'm sure, over time.
And I suppose the key thing there is connecting buildings.
Yes.
Particularly, when we have the density of the developments in the capital, it's actually how the buildings connect, not just what they look like from above.
Yes, no, definitely.
Can I open to the floor? We have a microphone for clarity. We have maybe a response from the planning team or a question. Tom.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Robert, for that excellent talk. Really, really interesting. Tom Lancolos from the City of London planning team, by the way. But my question isn't about planning, actually. It's about Alberti and his generation, their reactions to the ruins they were measuring in Rome. Was there a sense of awe that they found themselves having, a bit like the Saxons with the ruins of the city? which may have led them to their affairs. And did they carry any of that ore through into their subsequent work? And is the ore experience now similar in respect of ancient ruins in terms of the giganticism and the sort of the exemplary skill that it embodies, or is it more the time distance that we now experience between ourselves and that civilization?
Yeah, there's no doubt there was a great emotive response engendered by the ruins of Rome. And indeed, Alberti talks about Brunelleschi's own interpretation of the antique world and his creation of the dome of Florence Cathedral. And, he describes it as vast enough to hold all the people of Florence. And it was that sheer scale, that ability, which until Brunelleschi, no one had, mastered or been able to find a way of recreating reliably. Or indeed, as I mentioned earlier, the use of perspective and so on. So there was undoubtedly a sense of awe and mystery. The mystery had been provided by the pilgrims who'd been to Rome, and obviously they were still very deeply religious in their Christian beliefs, but they also knew a lot more about the Greek world and the original Greek gods. So all these things were becoming entwined, and there was a great desire not to cut through that, but to somehow encapsulate it in the work that they did. And again, it's a real difficulty for a historian describing Renaissance buildings, because you describe its proportions, you describe its materials and so on, but the thinking, why they use proportion, why they use measure in a particular way, how they thought about buildings. Alberti says, an architect should never knowingly destroy what's gone before them when they build a building. It was held as precious because it was such an expensive process to get something, but it was also a means of urban and architectural continuity, to use the theme of this series. The Tempio Malatestiano, for example, in Rimini, Alberti's arches, which are sort of Roman and very pure in character, allow you to see the original, more medieval structure within it. So the one was set off the other, and you had that sense of historical depth and respect. So, definitely there was that belief that it should be more.
Very heartened to hear that, because one thing we try to do in the city is to share the same moods as those ancient societies which came before us, and that sense of awe and mystery is exactly what we're trying to stimulate in the cluster of towers. And many of them have ancient footings, as you have highlighted with 85 Grace Church, and we see that symbiotic link between the two as essential to what we're doing today. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Can we pass that?
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm sort of formulating a question as I speak, but one of the things that struck me as fascinating, and I loved this book. I read this book, without really understanding 90% of it, which, is probably still the case. But there was something in the quality of it about the sacredness of making a place in a patch of ground and then that having meaning that endures. That it really struck me as fascinating when you were talking about the Mithraeum. I was blown away by those pictures. And it's in terms of trying to sort of, tie into what the previous speaker was talking about, how we can reawaken our sense of wonder in what's, what we're actually living in and what's already there. And it strikes me that both in the case of, the Renaissance sort of archaeologists and also the post-war London sort of Daily Mail queues, is that they'd experienced this massive loss. And it was a sense of that opened them up to what was remained, being so precious. And I think now we often, I loved again the quote right at the end where you said, oh no, you tidy it all up and clip the hedges and everything, a bit like the Wallace and Gromit film at Christmas, if anyone saw that. And kind of nothing that really you can identify with or communicate with is left. And I wonder if you've got a sort of general feeling about, how we can approach preserving what's already there in the city, not only beautiful things and not only very, very old things, but just what happens to already be there, a bit like a dodgy old armchair in the corner of a room that may not be pretty, but it's where your grandfather used to sit or something. Has that become a sort of a general philosophy of yours that you could speak to?
And again, you mentioned the Second World War, and I was just digging through notes that Kenneth Clark, soon after the Second World War or thereabouts, encouraged with others, T.S. Eliot amongst them, the bombed churches as war memorials program. And he wrote a letter to the Times. And he says, a ruin is more than a collection of debris. It is a place with its own individuality, charged with its own emotion and atmosphere and drama, of grandeur, of nobility, or of charm. And I think that sort of chimes with what you're saying as well, that, I mean, at every moment in the history of a place, it's the problem of, it's maybe, well, in a way, the London Wall development of the sort of 60s, it has been saved by subsequent findings there, and much as you're saying in terms of more recent development as well, that uncovering the past and trying to evoke the emotions or understanding what was going on then is important. And I think certainly the idea, I was sitting in the one just north of St. Paul's, Christchurch one or whatever. It was a really lovely space there as well, which has a garden within it. And with all that's going on around you, there is a sort of a peace zone. It's very much like going into a church itself. It's a place of retreat. So all of those things are, so if you go to St. Paul's and you see Wren's monument and around him, and then all these great individuals and so on. I think we need that, the resonance of history in everything in a way, and it's gratifying that that is an ambition for the city as well.
Hello, I'm Sophie Jackson. I'm from MOLA, and I was involved in the Bloomberg project. And I was so pleased that you put those photographs up of the people visiting, because I think, and talking about awe and how people reacted to it, we one of the best things we did on that project, probably one of the best archaeological things I've ever done, was nothing to do with archaeology. It was actually interviewing the people who queued up in the 1950s. Sort of went on to Radio 4 and said, did you queue up? And, we thought we were after information from people. We thought we'd get useful photographs or details for doing the reconstruction. But actually what we got was emotion, really, really powerful emotion. And, and it was an unintended sort of experiment, really, in seeing the impact of seeing an archaeological excavation, but 60 years on, which was when we interviewed them. And seeing the archaeology had, seeing this stuff being uncovered had influenced where they went on holiday. One woman named her daughter, she was pregnant when she went, she named her daughter Mitra. So Mitra actually turned up to the event. She wasn't particularly happy with that name, it had cursed her. But it was a really, really powerful thing. And one thing I would say is, with planners in the room, it's always great if you can facilitate on a development at least a chance for people to see the excavation. I know there's a lot of health and safety concerns, but just opening it up has a huge impact. But then in terms of the redisplay, every site is going to be different. Every situation is different. But it's how to tap into that emotional experience and the stories that come with that site. Yeah.
That's very helpful. And I think I was impressed by the rereading the Grade 2 listing by then English Heritage for the site, and it says in terms of summary of importance, this structure is the only known Mithraeum from Roman London and one of only a handful discovered in Roman Britain. And then it was one of the most important and popular archaeological discoveries of the immediate post-war era. Interest was such that the public queued to visit the excavations, and its future was the subject of intensive media campaigns which finally resulted in the removal and reconstruction of the site. in essence, the reconstructed temple represents one of the first examples of development-related archaeological conservation. And they go on to say, well, it wasn't obviously a very good reconstruction, but that wasn't the point. It was the emotive aspect of all of that which was important.
Yes, and if I can just add a postscript to that, it was very interesting the reaction of archaeologists at the time or just afterwards. And there's a magazine called the London Archaeologist, and I think 1968 or 65 issue of it, a very eminent archaeologist, I won't name them, went through the experience of the Temple of Mithras and said, you know, he was very careful not to see excavations because, and then there was some basic maths, you know, that 200,000 people visited the Temple of Mithras in 2 weeks. And the article went on, you know, that was just after the war, but now with improved transport, the seaside. And developers will never let us get onto their sites to actually do any archaeology. So we've got to keep all this quiet. So it's, yeah.
I suppose a question I'd be interested in hearing people's response to would be, have MOLA and Foster and Partners got it right? I mean, in a sense, obviously people were drawn to it when it was on a car park off Victoria Street. Was it important? I mean, to put it underground obviously makes it closer to the idea of a cave-like experience, but maybe all you needed was a few candles or whatever, and nothing else. I mean, so there is a line to be drawn between how much technology goes into apparently enhance the experience, or whether you just leave it be, or whether you could, I guess you could do both. You could have days when you see it candlelit, and you have days when it's all singing and all dancing. But yeah, no, be interested.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I feel I should just follow on from that because really interesting hearing Sophie's reflection, and thank you for your talk. In response just to Jane and I, my sister Jane and I are actually doing a commission at the Mithraeum, and I actually feel that I appreciate it's a really delicate subject to talk about how one encounters history and how one engages with something that meaningful and archaeological. But I also feel that what they're doing at Bloomberg and at Bloomberg Space is inviting artists to come and actually engage with artifacts and interpret in a way that actually provides an educational basis, but also kind of, I hope, also gives a reinterpretation, but also gives another accessibility in a way that I think is not just wall text. And it's, I mean, this is a wonderful talk, but it's also a way of making it come alive in a way, in a bit of a way. Sorry, did you want to finish? No. And so I think there is a real reach out to that. I also think there's something very intriguing about it's my understanding that the temple itself is sited on its original site. So not in Bloomberg HQ, but actually on the original site. So I just sort of thought that perhaps should be cleared for everybody. But thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, just wanted to add that, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but it has an immersion there, which I think is very important for given the fact that, yes, it won't ever be quite the same encounter preserved, given its situation and given its unfortunate history and circumstances, how it arrived and where it was moved to and where it was relocated to. But there is something very unique and interesting about having that ability to access something that actually travels you into something that looks at process, looks at a kind of knowledge and a process knowledge, but also gives you that immersion and experience, which I think is not a negative. And, you know, it's, you know, we're from the Northeast, so we're not from LSE, and we're happy to do something.
We're still going there.
We're still Geordies. There you go.
Thank you.
I thank you also for the wonderful talk. I did find it quite interesting with the Temple of Mithras that it is in a basement area, so you have to go down through all the stratifications of London history. And I found that personally quite moving. I love imagining what all the different layers are. Was that intentional as part of the design?
Well, as the last contributions, I mean, I think it's 7 meters below ground level, and it is at the correct, I believe it's at the same level as it was found. It's just that it's not in exactly the right position because of the remains that they didn't excavate. So yes, and I think that was very much something that they wanted to recreate, was that sense of a journey through history, and I think it's having that space in between the street above and going down, which certainly worked for me as well.
It's magical.
Yeah.
And that links in very nicely with the talk that Sharon gave of the London Museum, and that sense of going through the layers of London in terms of a big staircase that takes you down to, as I understand it, actually the lower level, which is Roman. So again, this, people will experience that at a much bigger scale in terms of a museum. And I think it's very interesting that the Mithraeum has to not reinvent itself, but it has to continue to engage. Because I think it's still very popular. I don't know what the numbers are like at the moment in terms of a constant flow of visitors. But actually how you continue to, my question is, how do you continue to get the engagement and basically funding? This is something that the developers or owners of the buildings, and that comment about being dusty is probably, the fact that the engagement needs to be continually developed for its audience. Otherwise it's...
I think, yes, and in terms of a number of the other comments we've had as well, I think where we're, if you like, fortunate in London is that these things are being discovered and they're fragments. I think the problem for me when I was a young man going to Rome as a student and spending 9 months there, very privileged as I was, the remains had been so stripped of any quality in a way. They were just huge. I mean, Colosseum, etc. But then when you look through history books and you see how people inhabited those sites, and of course the director of the British School at Rome was an archaeologist, and I remember sitting down at one dinner and it was said that in my usual naive way that I wanted to do a design project whilst I was there to re-inhabit the the mausoleum of Augustus with housing, because that's how in the Middle Ages, all these buildings had been appropriated. You had it was a bit like Alberti was saying, you make use of what's there, you don't destroy it. But equally, archaeology at that level is a form of destruction. It prevents, the whole of the centre of Rome, or big chunks of it, are arguably dead. And then the same happens in another way with places like Venice, where history dominates so powerfully that the living isn't given much of a look in. And I think that we're fortunate that we're not dominated by anything except tall buildings, perhaps. But I
with what they offer.
With what they offer, yes, and that segue to.
So I'm Gwyn from the city. I'm Tom's colleague. The one thing I think we need to be careful of is the people aspect of archaeology, because for me, archaeology is a celebration of change, and how the younger people, children, interpret change as being relevant to them. One of the kind of really poignant, well, not poignant moments, but if you go into the Vine Street Roman Wall exhibition, yes, you have the Roman Wall, which is wonderfully preserved. The star of the show is the history of change from that area, from pre-Roman right up to the present. And if you look at how children react, they go to the rabbit skeleton. The rabbit was a pet that was put to ground with ceremony in the 18th century. Or 17th century, 19th century. That's what children really engage with the past. And I think that's what we're trying to do in the city, is to actually celebrate the heritage, the archaeology, as something that all communities, because frankly, you look around the room, we're a kind of a symbol of demographic, is how do you make that relevant to those communities? So on 85 Gracechurch Street in the consented scheme, we wanted a schoolroom there for underrepresented communities to find a career in archaeology, to be excited about archaeology. And for me, we've got to link the divide between the academia and the preserve, the record, and the everyday engagement with archaeology, which is people.
If I can just add to that, sorry to hog the mic again, everyone. I think we need to be careful to be on easy terms with history and archaeology in general. And Robert, you gave a good example there of how certain places can be a little bit hidebound towards the preservation of remains above all else. And I think that, you know, in this, certainly in the current system that we have here in Britain, there is at times a painful sensitivity to change in relation mainly to setting. I think the argument about developing listed buildings or whatever has largely been won. And I think to build on the point about tall buildings, you know, they only dominate them if you let them. And actually, I think if tall buildings can offer a genuinely interesting mix of uses, compelling mix of uses, if they offer elevated public spaces, if they celebrate their ancient footings, as many in the city do, they need not dominate, they need instead be relevant and welcoming to one.
Yeah. Right, well, mine was a provocative statement, of course, having been involved in many tall buildings in the City of London. But, so, yes.
And brought amazing value to that, the sophistication that you've brought into the psychology of developing those schemes have been absolutely inspirational. So I thank you and Eric Parry for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Well, I think we'll wrap there, but I would like to just invite people to the next talk. And Jane and Louise Wilson are here today. So I hope you've seen how we do it. And we thank you again, Robert.
Pleasure.